My name is Chaz Ball. This programme is about a hijack that took place in September 1966 when I was in the Falkland Islands. An internal flight of Argentinian Airlines appeared in the skies above Port Stanley when I was doing teaching practice. It was 300 miles off course. I had just arrived at the start of a year to work as a travelling teacher as part of the British volunteer programme. The next thing we knew, the plane had crash-landed on the racecourse, there being no airport, and the story I'm about to tell begins. In 1966, I decided to have a gap year. We had an opportunity, I felt, that which if you didn't take when it was presented, you'd find yourself going sort of from education to another education institution. So I applied to volunteer with voluntary service overseas, and to my amazement, I was selected. To get to the Falkland Islands was quite a long trek. We flew to Amsterdam and got a VC-10, which is a sort of, in those days, a pretty modern plane, and it took 17 hours to fly to Montevideo. And then, after a short wait for the next boat, which was a monthly event, we got on the Darwin, which took fruit and vegetables and all sorts of goods on a nearly 5-day voyage in the South Atlantic to get to the Falklands. And I can distinctly remember coming into Jackson Harbour, which is where Port Stanley is, and seeing what I now realise the Great Britain, which we see in Bristol, restored, beached in the harbour, and that was my first impression. So in general, I found it a very welcoming and in some ways, familiar sort of place, in the sense that people spoke the same language as I do, and shared a lot of the culture, because they were historically many of them from Scotland, Wales and England. I was based in Pebble Island, and I would teach there for 2.5 weeks before I then moved on to the next place, which to begin with was Shag Cove near Port Howard, and then thirdly to Keppel Island. And altogether, at any one time, I had about 7-8 children, and I was their only teacher. And 2 of them were 5-year-olds, and I was their first teacher, which was a great responsibility. On the 28th of September 1966, I went into the school to do teaching practice. And at some point during the morning, we heard the noise of a low-flying, large plane. As someone who was pretty used to that in my daily life, I wasn't quite as disturbed as the children and the teachers. But clearly it sounded like a plane was flying overhead, and we were really bemused. How could it? Because we were a long way from any flight paths. Anyway, it turned out, as the morning went on, to have been an emergency landing. Now, at that time, Port Stanley didn't have an airstrip, and the pilot chose to land this plane on the racecourse, which was the best decision he could have made, because it was the only sort of open piece of flattish, or the rather soft land that he could have chosen. And as the day went on, we were due to go to Government House for lunch with the governor's wife, and so we smartened up and got in the car and went. Had a lift to go for lunch, and we actually passed this plane on the way and knew something was amiss. And as we sat for lunch, it became increasingly obvious that there was a bit of an emergency, and in fact during that period a state of emergency was declared. So it was really one of those totally memorable days. The state of emergency that was declared either during or after we'd had lunch meant that there was a mobilisation of the Falkland Islands Defence Force. And during the afternoon, my colleagues, the 2 guys that I went with, who both went to schools where there were Army Cadet forces, volunteered us, although I must admit in my case, I volunteered without my prior sort of discussion, because I had never handled a gun, let alone a semi-automatic rifle, in my life. But as a result of volunteering, we were asked to report to join the activities of the Defence Force. The hijackers were armed. They were from a group called El Condor, Peronists, right-wing Peronists, and there were 19 of them. And the plane they'd hijacked was a 60-seater from Aerolíneas Argentines, internal flight, 60 seats, and therefore there were actually 26 passengers, some of whom were children, who were part of this unfolding incident. The Falkland Islands Defence Force had about 150 people who were trained and were at any time on standby. I suspect this was one of the most significant things they'd ever had to do, but there seemed to be a willingness just to sort of get on with it, to take appropriate orders from those with experience. And to me there was no sort of sense of panic whatsoever. But this was clearly something that was new to everybody, even though 2 years previous a light plane had landed and planted an Argentinian flag. This was something different. This was 19 armed people coming in and expecting to be able to liberate the place. So in that sense, I felt it was well handled, and if you read the transcripts afterwards, the whole thing was very British in its way of keep calm, carry on, you know. I mean, the Falkland Islands is a place of, particularly in the 1960s, a place where life is relatively peaceful. That the most significant events is the monthly arrival of the Darwin, and people listened to every evening the schedule for the two de Havilland and Beaver float planes, which I subsequently caught fairly often. To get to my beat, if you like. So this was out of the ordinary in all sorts of ways. But strangely, because communication was so limited, the newspapers, for example, didn't cover this event in Britain until October the 6th, which is about just over a week later, because it required getting pictures and journalists, you know, from by plane and by boat. The hijack was resolved by a process of negotiation led by the Catholic priest who worked with the purser of the flight, who was an English-speaking member of the crew. And gradually the hijackers let hostages go. So we start with, I think, women and children, and gradually some of the passengers and some of the hostages from the Falkland Islands who had been incarcerated. They were running out of food, they were cold because they were dependent on heating and air conditioning that was no longer working because the motors of the plane had been switched off. And they were then persuaded, after about, I think it was from probably at least 2 days from the point of the hijack, to surrender, and were escorted to a community centre where they were held pending the arrival of an Argentinian warship, which had been requested in order to take the hijackers away, who were the first to board and were under arrest, and then latterly the 26 passengers who left, and some of the crew. When it was all over, I was very keen to sort of get on with what I'd come for, which was to learn to be a camp teacher, an itinerant teacher. And I remember about a week later being really pleased to be booked onto the internal flight and making my way to Pebble Island, where for the next 10, 11 months I sort of learnt to live in a very remote part of the Falkland Islands, not just a remote part of the world. And that my main memories of the whole year are of living in what was physically a wonderful place. I've always been interested in the sort of subsequent history of the Falkland Islands, and obviously the fact that it forms a major part of our recent history thanks to the 82 war. Not a lot of people make the connection between 1966 and the 82 war, and I think they should, because this incident happened the year after the United Nations passed a resolution about Britain and Argentina collaborating over some form of decolonisation. And I think there is a direct link. But if you say, what do I think about it today, then I feel as though we owe it to the environment of the South Atlantic, whether it's fishing, oil exploration, the Antarctic, to hope that Britain and Argentina would find a way to actually collaborate, and that means coming to some understanding about the Falkland Islands. It's 50 years since this happened, and I feel we should recall the events and hear from others who were there and played a part. This was not just an early example of aeroplane hijacking. It was an early episode in the deteriorating relationship between Britain and Argentina that later led to all-out war in 1982.